Bonjour, bonjour, mes amis. It is delightful to be here with you this evening. I'm joined by the ever magnanimous Dr. Lara Varden, and tonight we have the pleasure of talking all things autoimmune, all things gut, and eventually what it's going to boil down to, all things poop as well. So, Dr. Varden, are you ready?
I am ready. Yes, one of our favorite subjects.
I know, I know. My sister was a tomboy of the family for a long time, and she would always make all these poop jokes, and I would recoil. And she loves bringing that to my attention now that professionally I work with poop, and I no longer get to do that.
Well, it is important.
Yeah, she remains my sister evermore. So I'm excited to talk to you about things, and I'm excited for our audience to be here with us tonight. Our goal is always to show up and serve you best. So I know that if you haven't already, please do fill out the survey that we tossed out. We'll probably bring up the answers in about 15-20 minutes because we really want to make sure we're serving you and what you're coming here this evening to know. And I'm really looking forward to talking about things with you today, Dr. Varden. I think when you and I discuss, what we'll do is we'll kind of set the stage. We're going to talk exactly what is autoimmunity. I feel like this phrase gets tossed around a lot, just like inflammation these days. So we're going to talk about what exactly it is, right? And then we're going to talk about why the gut is so inextricably linked to its presentation, to quite literally the activation of some genes, right? A lot of people walking around with genes that say you should have an autoimmune condition, and yet not everyone has that autoimmune condition. So we're going to talk about the gut's role in that, how the gut can enliven genes or bring about. And then also we'll talk about what genes exactly, outside of the obvious offenders, right? What genes can help curate the space of the gut and help curate what do you do about it if you have an autoimmune condition, if you're trying to avoid one. Does that sound like a good roadmap for us this evening?
That sounds wonderful. And if people, actually, if we
Mm.
jump early in to see what our poll results are, I hope everybody has had a chance to answer the questions so we can kind of get a flavor about what people are dealing with, what their knowledge is, or, what they've been doing.
I love it. Let's do it. All right. So the first question we asked was, have you experienced any of the following symptoms in the past 3 months? And kind of some general symptoms, non-specific to a certain extent, but those that often kind of co-present alongside hallmark symptoms of autoimmune conditions. So we're asking about bloating or abdominal discomfort. Oh, well, dear, most of our audience, right? A lot of people in our audience are talking about joint stiffness and body aches, brain fog or trouble focusing, and low energy and chronic fatigue. There is a blessed 5% among the audience that is like none of the above. I hope that's truly a none of the above. If you're saying you actually just didn't write down the symptom, please feel free to toss it into the chat so we know. But I'm really hoping we don't see any of those for no other reason than I want there to be at least 5% that's happy and healthy. Um, the next question that we were asking is, do you or someone you love care about have an autoimmune condition? So about 56% of our audience this evening is showing up with an autoimmune condition, right? And another 10% is on their way to a diagnostic workup. And then another 10% is here for their family or loved ones. For those that did disclose they do, or that advocated for themselves and say they do have an autoimmune condition, feel free to share that in the chat. Only myself and Dr. Varden, as well as our team, but only us will be able to see that answer. So there will be an element of anonymity.
Anonymity.
Thank you.
There
Multiple
you
syllables, not going to get there.
go.
So it'll just be us. But we'd love to know kind of the lay of the land. If 60% of our audience is saying, I'm struggling with this, we'd love to know what form, because there's a lot of common mechanisms, but each one will kind of rear its head in a different way. So please do share that with us. The next question we asked is, if you do have an autoimmune condition or you're trying to prevent one, how are you managing it? I love that 75% of the audience is saying through diet. And then the balance are really saying we're looking at supplements, we're looking at stress reduction. And there's about 20% of this audience on medication. And that's great. I think all of these options, in particular for more advanced stages of autoimmune conditions, all of these are beautiful and perfect responses here. So I'm curious, especially for those who are focused on diet. I'm curious what that is. I know autoimmune paleo is really popular. I know gluten-free, a flavor of autoimmune paleo is going to be up there too. I'd love to know if there's any other diet sorts out there, what people are doing to support that, because diet's such a diet's such a tricky and delicate one. I always find it interesting that people with true autoimmune conditions feel best when they go through periods of fasting, right? When that gut biome is truly resting, relative to kind of digestion, etc. Yeah. Oh, I'm seeing some low inflammatory diets. Okay. Thank you, Rachel, for tossing that one in there. The last question we asked here was, have you ever done any kind of DNA testing, either for health or for gut? A lot of our audience this evening has done their DNA 360, and I'm grateful for that because we're going to talk about several genes later on in the presentation. So make sure you have those handy. Dr. Varden, do you want to share what genes those are so people can get them ready?
We are going to be talking about the GST genes. Okay,
Mhm.
so this can be found in your anti-inflammatory section. We
Mhm.
are going to be talking about the FUT2 gene. Actually, that you will more find in the diet nutrition under microbiome. And
Mhm.
we also talk about the GST1 in that particular uh, sub report. And then we're also going to be talking about the HLA genes. And these are the genes having to do with gluten, celiac sensitivities,
Mhm.
things like that. And that you will find in your diet nutrition reports in the carbohydrate sub reports.
Mhm. Yeah. Good. Thanks. Yeah, and I think so majority of our audience has done the DNA 360, and then a few have done some stool testings for gut, as well as some blood work. I think especially if you've gone to the doctor to work up your autoimmune condition, you've almost definitely done some blood work there. So thank you. We'll make sure that we keep really focused on kind of the general as well as people. I'm seeing a lot of Hashimoto's in the chat
Yeah.
here, some RA. So we'll make sure we really touch on some of the more popular autoimmune conditions, and it's on the rise, right, Dr. Varden?
Right.
We're seeing greater and greater levels out there than we would expect or have historically seen.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just, I'm seeing more and more thyroid issues or people
Hmm.
who come in who have already been diagnosed and
Yeah.
on things like Synthroid and, just
Hmm.
want some help. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, I mean, as someone that, like, I mean, if you've tuned into more than one webinar, you know that I have the joy that is celiac. I'm denied my deity that is the croissant, and there's hope, right? It's not one of those things where um you're kind of stuck in this life where it's not going to get better. You have to learn what to live with it to a certain extent, and what will trigger, and then that becomes the joy of your life in part because it enables you to live a happy and healthy life there. Yeah. So why don't we dive in?
Yes.
Why don't we first speak to what exactly is an
On,
autoimmune? We don't have to be disease specific at
right.
this point, but what exactly is autoimmune? So I know it to be when the body starts to attack itself. If we take the words literally for what they are, autoimmune, auto meaning self, immune meaning immune, but immune
Immune
going
system.
after
Yeah.
self, right?
Yes.
So do you want to talk us through that a little bit, Dr. Varden?
Absolutely. So, really, when we are talking about autoimmunity, it is a
Mhm.
condition in which the body's immune system mistakenly attacks its own cells and tissues. I
Yeah.
mean, bottom line. And
Hmm.
the reason being is because our immune system, so we're talking about like our white blood cells, and that they're thinking that our own cells and tissues are harmful invaders. And so that's why it's attacking. And that immune misfiring can lead to chronic inflammation, tissue damage. And I'll tell you,
Hmm.
we've talked about this before on several webinars that inflammation, that chronic inflammation is the basis of so many conditions.
Hmm.
So, there are actually over 80 recognized autoimmune diseases.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
some of the most
Yeah.
common, are what many of our viewers are suffering
Mhm.
with.
Yeah.
Hashimoto's thyroiditis, that affects the
Yeah.
thyroid, rheumatoid arthritis, which is affecting the joints,
Hmm.
diabetes, affecting the pancreas,
Hmm.
lupus. that's affecting multiple organs. And
Yeah.
then celiac disease, the gut lining. So, I mean, those are just a few,
Mm.
but like I said, there's so many. But really, when you consider underlying causes of autoimmune diseases, they are so multifactorial. Yeah, they do often involve genetic predisposition. It finds weaknesses, and
Mhm.
that's where it ends up showing up. But really, the environmental triggers, infections, toxins, diet, these all play a factor. Just like, the genes load the gun, environmental
Yeah.
triggers, toxins pulls the trigger.
Yeah, yeah. And I think this is a really important point to hear. So I'm quickly reading through the chat, and there's been several people that have said, like, I've just done my DNA 360. I haven't gotten results yet, or I recently got results. And I really want to encourage both those that are reading the results for the first time, but also just this general concept of genetics, which I think is very important to understand, that Dr. Varden has beautifully articulated here. There are a lot of genes that people carry that are not necessarily being expressed. So, for example, within the 360, we talked about HLA is a gene that is really well known for autoimmune conditions, in particular, or amongst those, celiac or and separately, non-celiac gluten sensitivity. There are a lot of people that will register with SNPs of the HLA gene that say you have a predisposition towards celiac disease. But this is also very important. Only 10%, it depends on the study. It will sometimes range up to 15, as low as 5, but 5 to 15% of people with those SNPs will present with celiac. That's important to hear. That means between 95 to 85% of people with those SNPs do not have celiac. They are not fatalistic. And I think the important thing that we really want to dive into today, especially as we dig into the gut, right, is this question of, well, what is the difference between that 5 to 15% and that 85 to 95%, right? Those that have versus those that do not. That's the really important thing. And I think for those even with that expressed autoimmune condition, understanding this really also helps with the management of that condition in concert with whatever your doctor might have recommended. Nonetheless, I think understanding the why behind this really supports and curates how do you go about supporting your condition. Right, Dr.
Yeah, because
Barton?
really, I think that the severity of the symptoms really works on a spectrum,
Mm-hmm.
and the lifestyle, the diet, the toxic exposures, those things that pull the trigger,
Yeah.
when they are focused on changed in such a manner to benefit health healing, I think the spectrum of symptoms, you can start moving that dial back and
Mhm.
forth where you can lessen the severity. You may not ever, totally get rid of it, but
Mhm.
at least make it where you're more comfortable and it's not so forefront on the mind, where it actually is disruptive in your daily life.
Yeah. Yeah. So briefly, just for our audience's sake, I'm going to quickly go over some things that might trigger, right? With awareness that Dr. Varden and I are going to jump really deeply and happily into the gut, into some more of the gut related things. So from a trigger perspective, obviously having a gene kind of helpful to developing the condition. So that's kind of a risk factor right there, having the actual gene. But next and more pointed to that, how do you actually trigger, for lack of better phrasing, that gene? Oftentimes it will be related to an infection, right? So there's a lot of mimicry that happens within the immune system. So you get an infection, the immune system's like, cool, I need to remember that so we never deal with that again. And viruses, to a certain extent, have evolved to look like us, right? Look like self cells, one, so they can evade it, right? The body is trained not to attack itself. And so viruses tend to mimic and try to look like us so they don't get attacked. But this backfires a little bit within autoimmunity. And so, insofar as sometimes the immune system will see that virus, they're like, I'm going to remember that, but then they recognize it in itself, and that kind of triggers that immune system that begins to attack self thinking it's actually a virus. Okay, so that's one thing that can kick it off. Environmental toxins, so mercury, BPAs, mold, things of those nature, those are documented to have kicked off autoimmune conditions. Diet, unfortunately. So the diety that is gluten and croissant. Gluten will often do that. Casein, which is found in dairy products, it's a protein in there, will often do that as well. Certain food additives, there's a lot of evidence kind of mounting around certain preservatives, certain food products, things that make it into food that are not food, can trigger a lot of this stuff, right? Gut tends to be another one just on a separate list. Dr. Varn and I are going to jump into that. And last but not least, and we do want to pay homage to females, to women, right? While this isn't per se an exact trigger, women tend to struggle with autoimmune conditions or be diagnosed with autoimmune conditions at a rate of like 3 or 4 to 1. Dr. Varden, I don't know if you know the exact numbers, but it's quite disproportionate. I think for every 3
It
women, there's
is.
maybe 1 man, or for every 4 women, there's 1 man. Disproportionate. And of consequence, that a lot of research has gone into hormones. And so there is a big tie with estrogen. Namely, estrogen is something that helps modulate our immune system. And so we're thinking that there's a lot of mechanisms there, and we won't explore them tonight, but a lot of mechanisms there that estrogen can, to a certain extent, be detrimental and supportive of autoimmune conditions when it's out of balance. Before we jump into gut, did I miss anything? Can you think of anything else you'd want?
No, I think we should jump into that gut immune system connection and,
Mhm.
maybe get a little nerdy in there.
Oh, delightful. And please, to our audience that are listening, because I think we have a lot of, we call everyone here offenders, first time offenders. If you have anything that you'd like us to be digging into more or that we haven't dug into enough, please feel free to use the chat to let us know. Leverage the chat as much as possible. Also, if you have a question, so, feel free also to use the Q&A. At the end of these sessions, Dr. Varden and I we'll ping pong back and forth, and we'll take all the questions. So if you have something that's a little bit more elaborate, then can you please clarify what you just said? Toss it in Q&A and we'll make sure that we get to that at the end. Yeah. All right, Dr. Varden, let's talk the gut. Let's talk poop. Let's
All
talk
right.
all things in between.
Well, I will tell you, when you said about the gut being inextricably linked to autoimmunity,
Mhm.
absolutely. The gut immune system, that connection is absolutely central to the development and regulation of autoimmune conditions. And actually, about 70 to 80% of the immune system resides in the gut. I tell people, our gut, it strongly influences our immune
Mhm.
system. So, way back in antiquity when they said, all disease starts in the gut,
Mhm.
they were onto something for sure.
Mhm.
And, when we're talking about the immune system residing in the gut, it's primarily in the form of what we call GALT, G-A-L-T, which stands for gut associated lymphoid tissue. And this immune tissue constantly interacts with microbes, food particles, toxins, and it's deciding what to tolerate and what to fight. And, when the system gets overwhelmed or misregulated, that's when autoimmunity can develop. And this gets into what you were saying, that our immune system is constantly on guard. They are sentries. They are our troops that are looking out for the bad guys and want to protect us, and
Mhm.
seeing these little markers, or what we call CD tags, identifiers saying self, not self. And I'll
Mhm.
tell you, those toxins, those microbes, those, viruses, they are sneaky little buggers, and they can do a lot of different things to mask themselves,
Mhm.
and make themselves look like self.
Yeah.
Um, but when we're talking about things, leaky gut, okay, this is really important because what ends up happening, well, first of all, leaky gut means that we have increased intestinal permeability, meaning that the gut lining allows undigested food particles, toxins, bacteria to enter the bloodstream. Now, when you start doing that, that triggers an immune response.
Mhm.
And if that process happens repeatedly, the immune system may start attacking similar looking proteins in your own tissues, like we were just talking about. That leaky gut ends up being a precipitous of these issues. And when that's happening, as you have so beautifully already mentioned, that's the phenomenon called molecular mimicry. So, for example, gliadin, it's a protein in gluten that can mimic thyroid tissue. That's what is triggering to
Mhm.
Hashimoto's. Bacterial toxins, they can resemble joint tissue, which contributes to rheumatoid arthritis.
Mhm.
So, there's other aspects, but
Yeah.
I would love to have some of your input as we
Yeah.
move forward with this
Well,
information.
I think what you just spoke to too, because I find when I'm working on an intake for someone who has an autoimmune condition, one of the first things I'll ask, especially if they're like, "Oh, I have this autoimmune condition," I'm like, "Cool, what other ones do you have too?" Because unfortunately, autoimmune likes to kind of hang out together, and once you have one, you tend to get a few others. And part of the gut is the reason for this, right? In the sense of once you have that permeability and that weakness within the gut, once the immune system's a little bit on edge and starting to go a bit awry and attacking certain tissues, attacking certain things it thinks to be outsiders, that tends to snowball a little bit. And that's why autoimmune conditions tend to come together, right? I think if you have celiac, I mean, you're almost, I think, there's an increased rate of developing type 1 diabetes, or sorry, the opposite. You'd have type 1 first and then celiac after the fact. I think there's a crossover of about 10%, right? And you see things like lupus tend to have this, things like Raynaud's, right? That loss of temperature sensation in fingers.
Right.
So these things tend to come together, and this is an element of where the gut comes in really importantly. So if you are diagnosed current tense, 60% of our audience is with an autoimmune condition, tending your gut is not only really important to tending the condition you have, but also really trying to thwart the possibility of another one percolating up, right? What's worse than one autoimmune condition, too? And so I think that's a really important thing to think through. What are we doing within the gut to maintain its strength? And then separately, what are we doing in the gut to ensure that the immune system is being properly educated? Right, is being properly not frightened, but instead educated about the world and calmed to a certain extent, right? Because I think that really supports where you want to be starting with a lot of these, with a lot of the protocols there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, when you consider microbiome dysbiosis,
Mm,
meaning that imbalance
yeah.
of gut microbes, that truly can impair the immune tolerance, provoking inflammation.
Hmm.
So people are going, okay, well, what disrupts the microbiome? Some of the major ones, antibiotic overuse. Now, it's not saying that you should never be on antibiotics or that they're not
Correct.
warranted. Absolutely, they are. But when you have chronic use and you're on them, I have some clients that, have had infections where most of the year, like every month, that they are on antibiotics. Well, obviously, that is going to disrupt the microbiome, and there are going to be downstream effects from that.
Hmm.
So really working on that prevention to not get sick in the first place. But, I'm basically just stating, here are some things that can disrupt your microbiome.
Hmm.
Poor diet. I mean, and we are again and again going to talk
Hmm.
about food, diet, how this is
Yeah.
affects it. Because when we're talking about poor diet, processed foods, ultra processed foods, sugar, seed oils, things that increase that inflammation, chronic stress, talked
Mm.
about this like ad infinitum. I mean, stress is a killer. Yes, that is going to affect your microbiome diversity, and create dysbiosis. Another major thing, toxin exposure. you know, the kinds of toxins that you may be exposed to, whether it be air, liquid, food, you know, amalgams, you know, whatever the case may be. But toxins can disrupt the homeostatic balance of your microbiome. And again, these end up increasing inflammation, possibly causing bowel disorders, you know, and a lot of the other, you know, issues that we had mentioned earlier.
Yeah. So I wonder if this is kind of where we start to transition into some of the genes, especially some of the genes that help us understand what sort of gut we're going to be setting up and what sort of reactivity and sensitivity we might be having in said gut. So why don't we start, Dr. Varden, why don't you wrap to us a little bit about GSTM1 as in Michael 1?
Okay, so GSTM1, this is part of the glutathione conjugation pathway. And this is something that why it's so important is because it really works into the biomes of the gut, of the lungs. And it is a key detoxification gene. It's involved in the phase 2 liver detox. It really is important for removing reactive oxygen species, environmental toxins, xenobiotics, metabolized hormones. And how it does this is it works by taking a glutathione molecule and attaching it, a glutathione being the body's master antioxidant, okay, and it attaches it to these compounds, rendering them harmless so they can be excreted out of the body. And what's really important, and you'll notice on your DNA 360 reports, again, you'd be looking under the anti-inflammatory system. And then there's a sub-report that specifically says glutathionization. Now, you will also see the GSTM1 gene sprinkled throughout your other reports
Yeah.
because it affects all of your other systems as well in some way or another, because
Hmm.
detoxification is not just honed into just one area. This is part of your immune system.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, and people can either have, this is a copy number variant gene. So you're either going to be showing that you have 0 copies, 1 copy, or 2 copies. And in this case, some people get a little confused going, hey, I got 2 copies. I'm optimal. And in this case, that is the case for the GST T1, T as in Tom, but for the M1, having 2 copies actually means that it's a little over aggressive. And truly, the more optimal version for us is having 1 copy. Where if you have 0 copies, that means that it's what they call the null genotype, and
Hmm.
where you have complete, you know, where you have loss of that GSTM1 activity. So,
Hmm.
you know, there's kind of that delicate balance in there. But I'll tell you,
Yeah.
I see a lot of people, probably about 50% of Caucasians, in even more in some ethnic groups, have 0 copies of that
Yeah.
gene.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm seeing in the chat a few people are like, oh, so I'm missing a gene. And the answer might be yes. If you're seeing a 0 beside something, the answer is yes, you don't have a copy of that gene. And unfortunately, that means you're not making that enzyme that's going to connect glutathione to whatever toxin glutathione might want to be getting rid of. But to Dr. Varden's point, number 1, to a degree, it's common, right? And you're still here and you're still kicking. It means that it's not something that's going to take you out, right? Any of those missing genes that would take you out tend to be in utero. Okay. And I think it's really important just to understand that copy number variation, because it really educates how your gut is going to be interacting with the world. An analogy that I like to offer here, I want to acknowledge it's a little bit uncouth, but I haven't been able to find a better analogy. So here we go. GSTM1, your presentation kind of tends to be a little bit like police forces in neighborhoods, there's a sweet spot that you want to find. If you do not, if you have that zero copy, you have no police presence, there's going to be a large group of people that are running around, running amok and doing things that they shouldn't be doing, right? If you have too heavy a police force, you have a community on edge and that is not joyful and happy because they're being over policed. And in the case of autoimmunity, right, the self body is attacking itself. You want that sweet spot in the middle, right, where you're getting the bad guys, but you're allowing people to be happy and joyful and not intruding on them. And this is really where I think the GST-M1 wants to be, that one copy, right? If you are no copies, your criminals are running amok. Too many copies, you're attacking yourself and you're detrimenting yourself. Okay, so that tends to be one of the first things. If you're someone with no copies, right, I think there needs to be a lot of additional extra care to how you tend your biome. There needs to be a lot of focus on what are you bringing into your biome, right? So that really looks at what sort of foods are you bringing in, right? Are you bringing in foods laden with pesticides, right? Are you bringing in foods that have a lot of preservatives or coloring agents or things that you need to be eliminating, right? So I think that through that. And then on the flip of it, right, if you're someone that tends to be a little bit more overactive, right, that tends to be people that really need to focus again on balancing biome, but also to the end of ensuring that they're not tipping the scales in any which way that would be encouraging that autoimmune condition, right? The diet's on point, right? When you become sick, you're really supporting body to that recovery so that you don't have that viral triggering, things of that nature, right? And working with a practitioner is really where you'd want to come in to understand that the best tools for you. Dr. Varden, do you like when you see someone either with zero copies or two copies, like what sort of testing are you doing? Like, do you do gut testing at this point in time to kind of figure out where the person's at?
Um, I don't necessarily jump to that first off.
Okay.
I usually will ask about their symptoms.
Mm-hmm.
But it depends.
Okay.
And this
Yeah,
is
no, of
where
course.
it really depends. For personalized health, of course, we also have to look at what tests do they already have.
Mm-hmm.
If they have nothing and we're really not working off of anything, if they're not complaining of many symptoms, they don't, really have anything, then no, I really wouldn't see a major need to jump into that right away. But say they don't have a lot of testing, they're complaining of symptoms that are seeming to correlate with more gut issues, maybe dysbiosis. There are certain like high sugar cravings, upset, to me, some of those things would indicate maybe higher candida or E. coli, lower beneficial bacteria like bifidobacterium or lactobacillus or akkermansia, or, some of these, in which case, yes, I would say, you know what, let's get this test done. Let's
Mm-hmm.
test not gas, but you have to be careful not to over test either, because
Yeah.
testing is not cheap. So we
Mm-hmm.
have to be conscientious of, the client's pocketbook as well. So, but definitely being warranted at, if that would give us or give me more information so I can better care for and recommend things to that client, absolutely, I will recommend that and get that. What about you?
Well, I think so. I'm a big I hope to be a cyborg one day. I hope to merge with the computer. I'm going to be so happy when I can do that. And I start to do that in my practice insofar as I really like to leverage stool testing that has AI analytics atop it. And let me be very clear as to why that is, right? So there are, to an extent, you're more bacteria, virus, et cetera, than you are person.
Mhm.
And so when you take a stool sample, the volume of information in there is incredible. You're learning about what exactly is in there. And this is the important part. what patterns are in there, what are the populations, right? And that tends to be the important part, because more and more within research, now that we have computers to do this really big work for us, right? Um, we now have the ability to do better pattern analytics, and we're starting to see a lot of pattern recognition when it comes to common conditions. So sometimes when someone comes to me and they're like, I don't know if this is inflammation, if it's autoimmune, one of the first points that I'll look to, especially if it sounds to be a little bit more gut-based, right, which inflammation often tends to be and autoimmune tends to be, I'll tend to do a stool sample that has that AI pattern analytics on it, because we're getting really good at saying, based on this patterning of bacteria, which means what type plus how much, right, of that, that can really give us insight into inflammation versus autoimmune versus. Is it diagnostic at this point in time? No, I want to be clear about that, but it tends to be wonderfully directional as to what's going on. And the cool thing too is it can also say, like, hey, if you have this sort of pattern in research, we found that it does respond to this therapy, but it does not respond to that therapy, which then, when you're talking autoimmune and how personalized that treatment protocol has to be for gut as well as body, that can be really helpful and directional. So it's not every person, but I think for some of the more fuzzy cases, fuzzy meaning I'm not entirely sure where to go because there's a lot of factors at play, stool sampling can be one of the points that I will go to, because I think it speaks to gut. And if you have that overlay of the patterns, it becomes all the more powerful as to what it could be, narrowing down that differential. Yeah, so those are my thoughts. I hope that was helpful for GST-M1 out there. Um, I'm glad the analogy was helpful. And so just to address a few people, I see Robert and a few other people. If you're seeing null, it usually does mean 0 copies.
Right.
Okay. Um, and I think that's it for our M1 questions. I hope I didn't miss one. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time to jump into the glory that is HLA. Um, so for those that are a little bit unfamiliar with how we're going to be talking about genes here, HLA is a gene singular. Okay, so it's one gene. And I want you to think about a gene like a book. Okay, so if you pick a book off a shelf, there's going to be a bunch of pages in there. Different genes will have different numbers of pages. And if you're reading a book, not every page is going to have a plot defining moment. Some pages are just meant to be beautiful. Some pages are meant to develop characters, right? They add to it, but they don't per se matter to the story. And then there's going to be certain pages like 163 that tells you who done it, with what, and all that other fun stuff. Those pages, when we're talking about this analogy of genes, are something we call SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And those tend to be the plot points. Those are the points where we know on that gene that tells us what's up. Okay, so right now we're going to talk about the book or the gene that is HLA, and we're going to be talking about 6 different pages, 6 different SNPs that have very important plot points on them. And this is very, very, very important autoimmune. HLA in general is a book that is on autoimmune. So many words on autoimmune. But we're going to be focusing on gluten sensitivity or celiac, because once you have an autoimmune condition, there's a lot of evidence that kind of gluten by and large just tends to be an aggravator. And so it's really important to know your HLA status in regards to gluten, because I'll be plain, I think gluten is the best thing in the entire world. I wish I could have it. That said, if you have a condition, it's probably one of the worst things you could be doing for your autoimmune condition. And so knowing your HLA status there helps that decision point between croissant or no croissant. So Dr. Barton, do you want to talk a little bit about what HLA can tell us about celiac and separately non-celiac gluten sensitivity?
Yes. Okay. So first of all, sorry,
No, you good.
HLA. What does that stand for? That stands for human leukocyte antigen. So leukocyte meaning, our white blood cells, a part of our immune system. Now, these genes actually encode molecules that are found on the surface of immune cells that help our body recognize self from non-self. Okay. And the HLA system is really essential for immune surveillance, especially when distinguishing pathogens from the body's own tissues. Now, there are a lot of different HLA variants, but two in particular are strongly associated with gluten sensitivity and celiac disease. Now, Dr. Kosterman has already mentioned about these. You will find these particular genes. We actually look at 6 of them, 2 that are more specific to or in relation to celiacs. Remember, these are not diagnostic. Okay, this is just
Ding, 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 ding.
informative for sensitivities or potential sensitivities. Okay, then the other 4 are for non-celiac gluten sensitivity. So, gluten being that molecule that is often found in wheat and wheat products. There's actually certain glutens that are also found in things like corn and in other, but we're not going to go down that, rabbit hole right now. So just in general, part of the HLA, again, I do want to say that carrying genes that have been deemed as sensitive does not mean you will definitely develop celiac. Okay. It just increases your risk. More importantly, it actually primes the immune system to act abnormally to gluten. But when you take precautions and you don't poke the bear, then he's not going to wake up and growl at you and try to kill you. So,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but really, when we're talking about the influence of gluten reactions, so an antigen is part of a molecule that is like that identifier that we had talked about earlier. And these molecules, these HLA molecules, are particularly good at binding to gluten peptides, especially gliadin, which I had mentioned earlier, and presenting them to immune cells as foreign threats. All right. So, this can trigger pro-inflammatory T cell response. It can promote the release of cytokines, autoantibodies. But when overactive, or if there are these triggers, it can actually start to damage the intestinal lining, especially the little villi, the little finger-like projections in the small intestines. And, that's where we start getting into bowel disorders and, even getting into the leaky gut issue that we had mentioned earlier, because inflammatory damage caused by gluten, all right, with carriers of these HLA variants can actually lead to increased intestinal permeability, that leaky gut that we talked about sooner. And then the dominoes just start falling. And, like you had said, one thing kind of leads to another.
Yeah, yeah. Just to quickly answer, there's a few chat questions coming in. Where is this? So if you go into your diet and nutrition report, it's going to be a great night. Diet and nutrition, and then you want to jump into your carbohydrate report at the somewhere near the end of that report, you'll see this HLA reporting. So you'll see one of 3 responses. One is you're good across the board, no risk of celiac, no risk of gluten sensitivity. One is going to be you do or do not have celiac, and then the other one will be you do or do not have gluten sensitivity. So you can register in all ways. You could be no across the board, you could be yes to one, and you could be yes to both. Okay, so just as a heads up there, and I'm seeing some questions in the chat because I'm very acclimated to the stages of grief when it comes to gluten, and a lot of people trying to bargain with the devil of can I do this and not that, and there's an element of personalization here as well as an element of risk comfort. So I'm seeing within the chat there's an heirloom form of wheat. I don't remember the exact form of heirloom wheat, but it's supposed to be lower in gluten, especially if you prepare it in a certain sourdough way. Theoretically, it eliminates all the gluten, right? There's a few chains that do this so that people with gluten sensitivity can get away and maybe have a treat that is bread. By and large, if you're a diagnosed celiac, it's not something I'd recommend. And I think your pain following that is enough to tell you not to. For those that either have that genetic susceptibility but are not presenting, or separate to that, maybe have that gluten sensitivity but not necessarily celiac, okay? There's an element of it's up to you. I think if you're already navigating an autoimmune condition, you may want to think against it because we know that that autoimmune condition is always going to be an ongoing conversation between gut permeability, biome, and the immune system. And so if you're kind of adding in something that aggravates and makes worse that conversation, you're tipping, unfortunately, the scales at the side of autoimmune as opposed to the side of healing. Okay. Um, and that beautifully, if you don't have any of these conditions, maybe it's something you get to play with. Absolutely. I don't think it's healthy or natural for clinicians to say categorically gluten is bad. I don't think that was great PR. I think it needs to be something you have conversations with your healthcare provider and then really decide what is that risk profile. Right. So for example, theoretically, a celiac, the best thing I can do is only ever eat at home. But that doesn't work for me and my desire to be social. So I accept that at least 2 to 3 to 4 times a year, I'm going to be contaminated and in a lot of pain. But to me, that's worth it. So there's an element of a conversation with yourself. What is and is not worth it.
And a lot of it is being informed, making
Mhm.
informed decisions. You
Mhm.
know that having that piece of cake is going to make you bloated and not feel so well. Well, first of all, you could probably maybe find some things that could help alleviate that.
Mhm.
But going, you know what? It's going to taste delicious anyway, and I will suffer the consequence. Well, then you've just made an informed decision. So, I mean, I think that's really important. And even though in some cases, or I mean, in many cases, people with non-celiac gluten sensitivity, that have a good, healthy profile, no genetic major sensitivities, they could still probably benefit clinically from removing gluten. But again, a lot of it, especially in the US, in Canada, and in several countries that still use glyphosate, the
Mm.
glyphosate, um, and other herbicides, pesticides like paraquat, atrazine. Well, the thing is, that is a toxin. Remember how we said in the beginning, that your genes can load the gun, but it's the environment lifestyle that pulls the trigger, including the
Yeah.
toxins. So when you have glyphosate, which is not only used as that herbicide, as that, you know, um, in the soil that gets into the actual wheat product itself, it's also sprayed on top as a drying agent, as a finishing agent
Mhm.
to have it dry more quickly so they can harvest more quickly. So you're kind of getting a double dose of it.
Yeah.
So, and that has been shown to directly disrupt your microbiome, which the majority of it is your immune system, which then
Mhm.
again, there goes that domino, just,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
letting it go.
Yeah. D'accord, Madele. I think there's a lot of questions for us, so I think
There
it's time
are.
we start. Yeah, so I think it's time we start jumping into the questions. So I'll take the first one. The first one's coming
Okay.
from Andrew. So Andrew is asking, and hi Andrew, we see you here every so often. You may not like this answer though, and that's okay. So Andrew's asking very specifically around peptides, asking the difference between certain peptides and what might be a better consideration for gut health. What's the best version? How do I take them? What salt forms might I take them? Andrew, I think peptides can play a role in gut health. There's a lot of emerging research that really for the audience's awareness, peptides, um, kind of think about them like, let me find an analogy. Peptides are a bunch of amino acids. Amino acids effectively make proteins. Okay. Think about peptides kind of like a fragment. Mm, 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 mm.
They're a
Okay.
little
That
protein.
time, no, think about think about a castle, right? A castle is made up of a bunch of different parts, right? Think of a peptide kind of like a tower or a turret from that castle. It's part of a castle, but it's not an entire castle. But the cool thing about this turret is that it's a little bit magical. When it goes into the system, it can inspire the system to grow its own castle. So it's kind of like saying, I'm going to put a fragment of a protein in, which will then inspire the building of other proteins, right? That's the spirit behind peptides. And from autoimmune and from a gut perspective, there's some decent research that's saying there's something to be had here, that we throw in this magical little turret and happy little castles will grow within our gut in good ways, right? I actually kind of like that image, happy little castles.
Business.
Yes.
I like it.
Um, this said, I'm not going to answer this question live, in part because I'm not a peptide expert, but separate to that, I think this is getting into that element of personalized medicine where you have to do an intake. It would be, I would say, horrible of me to suggest one peptide over another, not knowing your personalized detailed history there, Andrew, or where you're going to acquire it. Peptides, unfortunately, are the wild, wild west right now. While if you can get a pure form, it might be good for you. Finding that pure form, finding that quality is proving very, very difficult. So I think there has to be larger, deeper conversations here. And so if you want to reach out, I'd really encourage if anyone's considering peptides, because I think there's promise when it comes to autoimmune health, when it comes to gut health. I think there's a lot of promise there. I think it's really important to have a one-on-one conversation with a clinician who's well trained in it and who knows how to safely support you in acquiring those, because there's a lot of counterfeit snake oil junk on the market that is ultimately detrimental to your health. Yeah. Dr. Varden, anything to add to that?
No, actually, I have actually worked with some peptides with
Mm,
clients, but again, that's a longer conversation, and it really
yeah.
is much more personalized, because there are so many things out there. So,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Yeah.
I do see a question by Robin asking, what's the anti-inflammatory section? Immunity? And well, the anti-inflammatory section is actually one of the 7 major systems, the reports that we have. So of the 7 reports, like we have mood and behavior, sleep, diet, nutrition, cardiovascular, longevity, and well, one of them is anti-inflammation or anti-inflammatory. So that is your like detox, where we actually focus more on those detoxification pathways that I had mentioned, your antioxidation being one. But the one that we focused on tonight was your glutathione conjugation. It actually says glutathionization, methylation, and vitamin D. So that's where the reports is. So the anti-inflammatory is actually one of the 7 major systems when you first open up your reports.
Love it. Yeah. All right. Chris is asking a question here. Does the DNA company do a blood test for all the types of food sensitivities and allergies? And if so, what is it called? So we don't have an off-the-shelf product. Off-the-shelf kind of meaning you can go to our website and pick that test for yourself. That is something that would come through a clinician. And so if you're interested in working with us to do this sort of workup, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. You can, our CEO loves getting these sorts of emails, so I'll put her email out there. You can just reach out to us at ceo@thednacompany.com. Let us know how we can be of support to you. So we do run it through clinicians, but it's not a product we have off the shelf, in part because you really want specific interpretation after the fact. And I think it's the interpretation that tends to be most important with a lot of those tests. So not to defer it, but I think personalized medicine is really, really important. And if you hear nothing else from tonight's webinar, it's please make sure, be it us or the provider that you currently have, make sure you have a really good, trusting, collaborative relationship with your care provider, because this is where that magic of medicine happens. And it often tends to happen in a team format, right? In the sense of you have a lot of little experts that are supporting the bigger understanding there, because there's too much to know to be found in just one person. So make sure you're working with your healthcare provider, your healthcare team. And if you want us to be part of that, We'd love to be. We love helping people. All right, Dr. Varden, do you want to get Olga's question?
Yes. And Olga asked, how do you know you have the gene and how do you look on 360 reports? So this would be if you have done your DNA 360 testing, you would have been emailed saying your reports are ready and you can log into your account through our DNA website. So if you go to thednacompany.com, there's a login drop down. You type, you just click on, it's like clinician, consumer, login. You click on that, you put in your email, your password, and then you are brought to the screens of where it is showing your reports, the ones that I had mentioned earlier. And where you're going to look again, we are focusing more on certain genes that we've talked about tonight that are shown in your anti-inflammatory profile, as well as in the diet nutrition under the carbohydrates subreports, which was the HLA, as well in the diet nutrition. If you scroll over, there's a subreport that says microbiome. And that covers and talks about these genes as well. So yeah, how would you know? Well, if you've done your report, that's where you can go. If you haven't done it yet, well, I would highly encourage you to get it done, to have this information. And that way you can also follow along when we do webinars and we focus on certain genes. Also, you don't necessarily have to go to the DNA company website. You can actually go to our app, the DNA Way app. You can log in, and that actually will have information, to report information, education, everything right there, right in your hand, right on your phone. Wonderful. It also gives you links to our webinars, to past webinars, to our podcast, to the digest, lots of wonderful things. So there's many different ways that you can access your reports.
Great. Now see. All right. It looks like we have a lot of newcomers to this. Robin, I have your question next, and I wonder we'll have to make a point, I think, to have a webinar for newcomers because I
Yes.
love the questions coming at us, and I think it'd be helpful for us to kind of, in a very slow way, do genes 101 and how you interpret some of this stuff. So for the powers that be that are listening, that might be something we want to consider. Robin's asking, how do SNPs, you got that right, show on the gene names, letters, numbers? How can you tell the stuff you're looking at as your gene? So just very quickly, and Robin, this may not be extensive enough, but feel free to reach out and we can loop you in with a call to help you better understand your report. Right? I think Bill's offering that already. But typically a gene will be called by a bunch of letters or numbers. So for example, we've talked about HLA, right? Just a bunch of letters. We've also talked about GSTM1, so letters and numbers. Okay. Um, and then typically what you'll see beside that is also going to be something called an RSID. So you remember how I was talking about genes are like a book and then a SNP is a page. So that RSID is effectively that page number, right? So we're saying, here's the gene, here's the page that we're looking at. And then after that, you'll typically, if it's a SNP, you're going to see two letters, AA, AG, something along those lines. That's your result. And then the DNA 360 will explain that result to you, right? If it's something a little more bespoke, meaning fancy, we got some dirt off our shoulders there, something like a copy number variation and indel, you might see numbers or, different letters that you wouldn't be expecting. And again, the DNA 360 will kind of walk you through what exactly it means. Because remember, when you're looking at a book, you're not just looking at pages, you can also describe the book in different ways. Is there a lot of pages to the book? Is there not a lot of pages to the book? We tend to do a lot of those details as well. So for example, copy number variation, like we were talking about with GST M1 as in Michael 1, we said you have that range of 0. Technically you can get up to 6 copies, but that's very uncommon. We just test up to 2. And that tells you really how much information do you have, how many copies do you have. So that's a different way of describing the book than focusing just in on one page. All right. I hope that was helpful. And again, if you want to jump on with Bill, Bill can give you a little bit of a better breakdown there. Um, Miss Dr. Varden, do you want to
Yes.
talk about Olga's next question?
Yes.
Hmm.
Bringing down, she's asking, how do you bring down inflammation? And that's a great question. And really, it is multifactorial. Um, because, like I had said earlier, inflammation is the basis of the majority of chronic conditions. Um, the only thing is that it's not inflammation is not just one thing. Really it starts getting into symptoms of, what are the symptoms that you're having, kind of backing it up. But when I was saying multifactorial, we have to think about what is causing inflammation. Remember, I told you that in the beginning, where your genes load the gun and environment, lifestyle, toxins pull the trigger. It is those things that are pulling the trigger that are causing the inflammation that then downstream show up in some pathophysiological way. So it really is a matter of going, okay, let's look at the things you are being exposed to, the food that's going in your mouth, the water that you're drinking. Does it have toxins? Is it unfiltered? Is there, other things that could be causing that inflammation in the gut? The air that you're breathing. Are you breathing? Are you in an area where there are toxins? Do you live near an airport or next to a golf course? And yes, no matter how beautiful they are, the reason why that the greens are so beautiful is because they do put pesticides and herbicides and other things on it to keep those weeds down. Well, that's not so good for us and our bodies. So, knowing where are the insults coming from. Okay, so how do you bring down chronic inflammation? Recognize what the triggers are, where the insults are, stop those, and then support your detoxification pathways. Make sure that you are supporting and getting the nutrients that your body, that your cells need and are craving so it can heal. Our bodies are naturally in a healing state all the time. It's just how well they're doing it or how quickly they're doing it really depends on the load that they're still having to carry, meaning the toxins that are still coming in, are they being overburdened? And do they have the nutrients, the energy in which to do the healing? So,
Merci, madame. All right. I have the next question again from Andrew, and Andrew's tossing us a fun question. I
oh, yeah.
got some heavy balls here, sir. All right. So he's asking, is there an endotoxemia blood test, urine test? What is the best way to test for that? So endotoxemia, got it all. Where it's really where bacteria, gut bacteria in particular, enters the bloodstream. So this is kind of getting at that concept of gut permeability to the end where these critters are actually getting into the blood. And so how do we test for that? So this is a very specific test. By and large, Andrew, I don't believe that there's a commercially available one right now. Most of it's done in research labs, in large part because of the volatility to actually test for it. It's really difficult to get an accurate marker. So typically it tends to be a little bit more proxy testing or like surrogate testing. So from conventional tests, you might see zonulin, I think oat test. So things like they just rebranded, or Mosaic does a good oat test. You can also see in basic blood work like HSCRP, there's a few other kind of surrogate markers. I think right now it typically tends to be some surrogate markers unless you're going to someone and doing a little bit more live blood cell analysis or you have access to a research lab. But I'd be curious as well if you're diving that deep down, like are there other better tests or other methods of inquiry and treatment that you could be doing, before jumping into a research lab? So again, if you need some support there, don't hesitate to reach out. Um, Dr. Biden, do you want to grab Rachel? Rachel, I think, if I can see that far.
Sure. So Rachel is asking, is it possible to supplement glutathione if you're missing GSTM1 and GSTT1 genes? So basically, saying if you have null variants or zero copies. And in this answer, I would say it depends. Generally, it's not something that we would necessarily jump to simply because your body may not know exactly what to do with it. It doesn't mean that you don't make any glutathione. It doesn't mean that, you don't have it at all. Okay. But generally, and again, this is more educational based, in more of a population, not saying for specific recommendations to anyone. But generally, we get some sort of history. Have they ever taken it before? Has it not been such a great experience? Have they taken it before and, oh, they've been just fine with it? But also really looking at the precursors. NAC, N-acetylcysteine, okay, selenium, alpha lipoic acid, milk thistle, things like this that help to promote and do jobs to help the body, but providing those basic building blocks where we're not putting pressure on the body with genes that it doesn't really know what to do with. So, and generally doing the precursors is always a good thing because glutathione is actually made up of 3 amino acids: cysteine, glycine, and glutamate. So, these things are very important. And there's a bunch of processes. Actually, it kind of is an offshoot of the methylation pathway and the sulfation pathway, but we won't dive into that little nerdy rabbit hole. But again, it kind of depends, but generally that's not the first thing that you would, go to.
Yeah, I think that's a solid answer. Yeah. All right. Robin's asking the question of what gut tests do you use? And so I would imagine this was kind of when I was talking around some of the patterning. So I'll be a little bit more specific to kind of advanced testing. You could consider the DNA Gut 360 Premium. So it would be a stool sample, send it off to the lab, and then the lab would come back with not only what all a stupidly extensive listing of everything that's in there, but more important to you, at least that pattern recognition. And then the so what. If this pattern is identified, you probably want to get a diagnostic workup, but separate to that, here's what this pattern will respond to, or at least what we already know it to have responded to. And I think the powers that be put that into the chat for you. So if that's something you're interested in, I'm a big fan. I don't say that to the end of selling kits. It's just that I get really, really excited when technology is able to further the precision and the awareness that we have over people's health. And I think in particular with the biome, technology is going to be the way, how we understand it, and really the only way, because we're talking about numbers that just our beautiful, meager minds cannot understand. Yeah. All right, Dr. Varden, do you want to talk through Chris's question?
Sure. So Chris is saying, can you do testing for carbohydrate sensitivities and or systemic yeast testing? Now, I'm taking this question as not genetic testing, but as maybe reactive sensitivity. I mean, because there's kind of some of each, because in genetic testing, yeah, we do have certain genes that we look at that can inform us, say, how well someone breaks down carbohydrates, specifically starches and other things that can influence their reactivity, and fat gain, or how they work, how that could trigger possibly insulin sensitivity or resistance. And again, there are so many players that we could just go into this entire playground of genes and how everything is connected. So yes, we do cover the genes, obviously. But when we're talking about the epigenetic effect, that say you're already having some issues and you're wanting to know, hey, is my body having an immune system reaction to carbohydrates and sensitivities? Well, yeah, there's testing out there. Things that test for like lactose intolerance and fructose malabsorption or FODMAP intolerance and lots of different things like that. Even getting into gut biome dysregulation, doing things like hydrogen methane breath testing that can test for some of those things. Now, as far as us offering it, yes, we do offer some testing through different platforms, but for our DNA company testing, we have our, Gut 360 that talks about our microbiome and, extensive, because we have our DNA Gut 360 as well as our DNA Gut 360 Premium. But as far as specific testing, like the hydrogen methane, things like that, we don't have a DNA company named testing, but we can get testing ordered.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think to piggyback off of that, I'll also go into Crystal. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Crystal. Um, I'll piggyback because I think it's two questions of a similar vein. Christelle is asking for an overall test analysis of gut and health. Would you do stool and oat? Is that enough for a full spectrum of vitamins, minerals, mycotoxins, bacteria, fungi, all the fun things? And my offering there, just as it would be to Chris, and I think Dr. Varden was saying this. Can you do that? Sure. Is that wise to the end of what you want it to achieve? I don't know. I think it's really tempting to do all the testings and get all the data, right? I'm a computer nerd. I love all the data. This said, the question is, why do you need that data and what are you going to do with it? I think if it's for overall health, I mean, a gut test, absolutely. I think in part because we're more bacteria than other. Oat test can be very powerful and very transformative if it's to the end of, I think, to your point, mycotoxins, bacteria, how the mitochondria is functioning amongst a few other things. I think there might be other tests, though, if you're doing pretty well and you want a general picture of health that I would be considering. Oat, I would only consider in certain cases. So I'd really encourage you talk to providers, talk to someone who knows what they're talking about, talk to someone who's not selling a test. I know the hypocrisy there of what I'm saying right now as I say, please do DNA 360, but you want someone who understands your health goals and can target tests specific to that, and who is also not you, a third party that can say, you're really focused on this, but have you thought about this? We might want to consider this as part of your health goal and what testing you might be wise to bring into your portfolio. So I really encourage people to work with practitioners because I think it ultimately gets them to a better point because there's more purpose as opposed to just trying to do everything all at once. Yeah, so I hope that was helpful. All right, Dr. Varden. Mike has a question, I think, for you.
Yes. So Mike Hoffman, and hello, Mike. Good to see you. I'm so glad you're here. Any thoughts or comments on SIBO, lactulose, or glucose breath test versus stool test or the words suspected SIBO, so small intestinal bacterial overgrowth? Yes, I mean, it's important to distinguish that when to use a SIBO breath test versus a stool test, because they assess very different parts of the gut and different mechanisms. So, there are some pros and cons to these, and especially when each is appropriate to be implemented. So, for example, like the SIBO breath test, that's, the lactulose or glucose. And really what they're measuring is they detect fermentation of the sugars, of those two particular sugars, by bacteria in the small intestine. And the bacteria, as they ferment, they release gases. the hydrogen, methane, sometimes hydrogen sulfide. Sometimes you'll get a mix of both hydrogen and methane, okay? These gases enter the bloodstream, they're exhaled, and the measurements and timing, obviously, there's different things which we won't go into detail about, but those can be very useful. The when to use those, this would be if there's indications, like if you have chronic bloating within like 30 to 60 minutes of eating, abdominal pain, with like inconsistent bowel movements, that you have intolerance to FODMAPs. These are fermentable carbohydrates. Maybe a history of food poisoning or something like that. So anyway, that could be useful. Now, when you're talking about stool testing, and yes, there's several of them, and yes, we have them. That is what we were talking about with our DNA Gut 360 and Gut 360 Premium. They measure colon-based microbiota. Pathogens, digestive markers, yeast, fungi, inflammation, things like that, showing dysbiosis, the phylum that will produce short-chain fatty acids, which are very important in the body. They look at the beneficial keystone bacteria, the pathogenic bacteria, where that works. So now, there can be a bit of an issue where stool tests, they don't diagnose SIBO. They can definitely be informational, but remember, SIBO stands for small intestine bacterial overgrowth. Stools access large intestine, the colon. So, SIBO, and they're not in the same place. So you can see indirect markers, but it's definitely not diagnostic. So really, it's just a matter of looking at which tests use, what to do. That really should be the decision between you, your practitioner, looking at the details of your case, of your symptoms, and what is most appropriate.
Merci, madame. I'm going to take the next two insofar as I'm going to speak to Lisa and Cynthia. So Lisa's asking, what if your celiac was induced from chemo treatment? Does that translate differently? I'm sorry you had to take chemo for whatever the reason. There's several. Regardless, I'm sorry that was kind of your path, and I'm extra sorry that it has inspired something. By and large, with awareness, I haven't really done a deep literature dive on this. I believe, unfortunately, the answer is no, it does not translate differently. So, we had that conversation of a lot of different people are going to have genes that predispose them toward celiac, but not everyone has celiac. There has to be something that kind of brings it online. Unfortunately for you, it sounds like chemo brought it online. It aggravated things enough. It created that space for autoimmunity such that your body is now going to attack itself in the presence of gluten. So unfortunately, it doesn't change anything, short of, and maybe this is something that happens in the future. It's not something that current tense is happening. There might be immunologic that can shift things up a little bit, but at present, I do not believe there's an immunologic. So you have to treat yourself as a celiac as if you were kind of born that way, not inspired by chemo. And my heart goes out to you because it's you'll feel a gajillion times better. It's gonna become a way of life. You'll get over it. Nonetheless, croissants are life. So I'm sorry. Cynthia's also asking the question of, it sounds like Cynthia was struggling a little bit to find where we have all this HLA information. So I'll just reiterate that. So there are 6 SNPs that we look at. Those are the 6 RS numbers. Unfortunately, Cynthia, or at least fortunately, I'll argue I don't know those SNPs off the top of my head, but where you can find them again is diet and nutrition. And then looking in the carbohydrate section, if you go into the app, I would offer it's a little bit easier to see them there because it will very specifically call out those RSIDs with your own genetic presentation. But for people, just remember, you don't have to do this computing by yourself. We do have an algorithm that will sort you out of you don't have either, you have celiac, you have gluten sensitivity, or you have both. So you'll kind of get bucketed into one of four categories. So you don't necessarily have to do that deep dive, but we do offer all the gene results so that you know how we got to that point. So Cynthia, I hope that was directive enough. If not, feel free to reach out to Bill. Bill can kind of meet with you and then point in the reports where you went, where you can find that if I wasn't specific enough. D'accord, Medell. Do you want to take the
All
next
right.
one?
Sure. So Lisa is saying that she heard me state prior, but she wants me to restate what helps with phase 2 in your liver when you have 0 copies
Mhm.
of the GSTM1. M is in Mary.
Mhm.
So remembering that when you have a null variant, no copies of your GSTM1, your phase 2 liver detoxification, okay, especially the glutathione conjugation pathway, it's significantly impaired. This means that your body has a harder time neutralizing and eliminating reactive toxins, hormone metabolites, environmental chemicals, and these byproducts that from oxidative stress, which can increase inflammation. So how do you support? Well, the thing is that I want you to please be aware. I said this before, but I'll say it again. You still produce glutathione, okay? It doesn't mean that you don't have any glutathione. It's just that the enzymes that use it efficiently for detoxification, especially with certain carcinogens and hormone metabolites, they're missing, okay? And this can put extra pressure on other phase 2 enzymes, especially your GSTT1, your GSTP1. Okay, so it's looking at them as a family, as well as your UGT genes, the glucuronidation genes. Those you'll find in your hormone and fitness reports. And then there's also other genes for methylation and sulfation that I kind of mentioned before. So how do you boost glutathione itself? Even though you have a null variant of your GSTM1, you want to support your body with the precursors. You want to give your body things like NAC, which stands for N-acetylcysteine. Remember, one of those amino acids that make up glutathione. Remember, I said it was cysteine, glycine, and glutamate. Okay. Then, and glycine also being another one. I mean, there's actually powders where you have NAC and glycine, and it has a sweet taste because glycine is sugar. So, alpha lipoic acid, selenium, things like that. That's where you want to make sure to support your body. And also B vitamins, B2, B6. You also want to help with that methylation pathway. Because remember how I said how they're connected, the methylation pathway, the sulfation and glutathione conjugation pathway. So I think that covers a good share of it, of what I had said.
Love that. All right. Our last question for the evening is coming from Cynthia. And again, I'm a tech nerd. I love this question. So Cynthia's asking, her DNA testing was done about 2 years ago. Has the testing changed? Should I update it? And I imagine, Cynthia, you're talking about ours, or at least that's how I'm going to operate for this question. So no, the testing has not changed, and there's no need per se to be updating. Your DNA is your DNA. And so the results that you have 2 years ago are still going to be your results now. What two different things that can change over time? Over time, we do add SNPs to our panel. We will be releasing a new set this year. And so, if those SNPs weren't necessarily captured, there might be motivation to retest, but it's not because genes have changed. It is because there might be new ones added. Additional, though, and I think this is something important for people to understand, the technology as to how we test DNA is growing exponentially day by day, month by month. And so, will your genes change? No, but will the way we laboratorily assess them change? Probably. And does that mean you need to retest? Maybe. I think we'll make a point if we ever find that laboratory testing has changed enough such that it is changing results, we'll probably update people. But I don't expect that to be happening in the next 5-10 years. It's just something I like to make sure people know, kind of sitting in their head, that, we're only as good as cutting edge science is right now. And beautifully, science is oh, it's blossoming so beautifully right now. There's so much to know and so much to do. So for now, you're good. In a few years, the answer might change. Yeah, so I hope for those that joined us this evening that were seeking to understand a little bit more around autoimmunity and gut found this really helpful. I know we kind of jumped really deeply into the gut side of it, especially, past that first half hour, but I think there is point and method to that madness insofar as gut is inextricably linked to all things autoimmune, to the immune, to how your body experiences the world, and is such an important point. So I hope this information was helpful. Oh, excellent. I'm glad to hear that, Rachel. I think we do send out surveys at the end of this. So if you want to let us know, this was great, this wasn't great, more of this, less of that, we want to make sure that we keep serving you. So let us know how we can serve you best, be it with topics or how we address different things. And I think that's it for this evening. For those that are still hanging on, um, we do have a She Summit coming up, and I want to make sure I mention that. So next week, Dr. Varden, help me time. I don't do time very well.
Yes, actually. Yeah, because it's the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, I believe.
All right, so next week, I don't do time very well, people, so trust her, not me.
Yep. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday of next week. It's May
Yeah.
20th through the 22nd.
So
Beautiful.
anyone can
Yes.
participate. The She Summit, it will be a beautiful host, including Dr. Varden, beautiful panelists that are going to be speaking all things fertility. And we want to do it in a very supportive environment. So we're really going to explore causes of infertilities, how genetics play into that, how hormones play into that, and what can you do to better support yourself. And we'll be doing it in a very comforting, loving environment, because that conversation hasn't always been comforting and loving. So if you
And
want to join
even the
us,
mental health aspect of it. That
Mhm.
is very important. Often a an ignored or not really addressed aspect of it. So that will be discussed as well.
Yeah. So if you or someone might benefit from that, please don't hesitate to jump into that. The goal is supporting people, right? Yeah. All right. I think that is all. I think we dance out now, Madelle.
Yes, and
Yeah.
we did well on time.
Oh, look at
We
us.
like
I
that.
love it. All right. Au revoir, mes amis. Thank you so very much. We'll see you again tomorrow evening. Au
Thank
revoir.
you so much, everyone. Have a great evening.